There is a comfortable belief, widely and precisely disseminated, that human beings are the only animals capable of changing consciously, that reason governs behavior, that wanting something is enough to transform it. That belief is neurologically inaccurate. What neuroscience has revealed over the past few decades is something far more unsettling. The brain is not a fixed structure that deteriorates with time. It is a system in permanent reconstruction, shaped by experiences, patterns, repetitions, and even thoughts. This means that what you do repeatedly does not merely train your behavior. It physically remodels the neural circuits that define who you are, not as metaphor, as biology. Norman Doidge, a Canadian psychiatrist and researcher, spent years documenting clinical cases that challenged what science considered absolute truth, that the adult brain was immutable. What he found revealed that men and women with severe brain injuries recovered functions that should have been permanently lost, that the brain of a blind musician developed sensory territories that did not exist in other people, that repeatedly negative thoughts carved neural pathways as concrete as paved roads, and that those roads could be entirely rebuilt. Welcome to the Invisible Decisions channel. For more than a century, neuroscience operated under a premise that seemed unassailable. The adult brain was a completed structure. Neurons that died were not replaced. Lost functions were not recovered. Biology was destiny. This view did not emerge from nothing. It arose from legitimate observations, consolidated by decades of rigorous clinical studies. Patients who suffered strokes frequently lost motor skills permanently. Lesions in the visual cortex resulted in permanent blindness. The localization of brain functions appeared rigid, mapped with almost mechanical precision. The neuroscientist Santiago Ramón y Cajal, Nobel laureate in 1906, went so far as to write that the pathways of the adult brain were fixed and immutable, as though the organ were a kind of machine whose parts had been definitively welded into place. For decades, this was the official truth of neurology. The problem is that official truths in science have a limited shelf life. They hold until the accumulated weight of data makes resistance untenable. In the 1960s, researcher Michael Merzenich began conducting experiments with primates that produced results directly contradicting the established consensus. When he surgically severed a sensory nerve in one of the animal's fingers and mapped cortical activity weeks later, the cortical territory corresponding to the operated finger did not remain silent. It was being actively occupied by neighboring regions. The cortex had reorganized itself around a new sensory reality. The neural map had changed. It was too early for the field to receive that information calmly. Nobody wanted to hear it, but stubborn data tends to prevail, regardless of institutional resistance. The word neuroplasticity joins two apparently incompatible concepts, neuron and plasticity. In scientific language, plasticity refers to the capacity of a material to be shaped without breaking. The plastic brain is one that can be continuously redrawn without losing its fundamental structural integrity. But what does that mean concretely? It means that every experience you have, every skill you learn, every trauma you absorb, every thought you systematically repeat leaves a verifiable biological mark. Synapses strengthen, new connections form between previously disconnected neurons. Entire regions of the cortex can expand or shrink depending on how much they are recruited. Neuropsychologist Donald Hebb articulated the underlying principle in 1949, before the word neuroplasticity even existed as a consolidated concept. The formulation became known as Hebb's rule. Neurons that fire together, wire together. When two nerve cells are activated simultaneously and repeatedly, the synaptic bond between them becomes stronger, faster, more efficient. It is the mechanism behind all learning and behind all habit, regardless of its value or direction. Doidge documented cases that seemed impossible in light of the previous model. A man born with half a brain who had developed over the course of his life neural functions that should have been exclusive to the missing half, as though the available tissue had colonized territories that anatomically did not belong to it. A woman with severe cerebellar damage who learned to walk again through an intensive neurological training protocol, defying the predictions of conventional medicine. A patient with phantom limb syndrome, intense, persistent pain in an arm that had been amputated, who was successfully treated using only a mirror. The therapist positioned the mirror so that the reflection of the intact arm created the visual illusion of two functioning limbs. The brain, processing that visual information, remapped the pain, not because the arm had returned, but because what the brain processes as reality is not necessarily what is objectively out there. It is what its learned interpretive patterns signal as being real. That is the point that transforms the understanding of how the nervous system works, and that renders the old model definitively untenable. Neuroplasticity operates in two directions, and this is where many people prefer not to direct their attention with genuine honesty. The brain does not only grow toward what you practice, it also systematically retreats from what you abandon. Neurons that are not activated weaken their synaptic connections. Unused regions are progressively recolonized by competing functions. The principle is brutally straightforward: use it or lose it. Merzenich demonstrated this experimentally by immobilizing the dominant hand of monkeys for consecutive weeks. When cortical mapping was performed after the immobilization period, the area of the somatosensory cortex dedicated to that hand had visibly shrunk. Another group of animals with the non-dominant hand immobilized had expanded the cortical map of the dominant hand because they were forced to use it with much greater frequency and intensity. In humans, the effects are analogous and rigorously measurable with neuroimaging technologies. Professional musicians who have played string instruments since childhood develop extraordinarily expanded cortical representations of the fingers of the left hand, the hand responsible for chords and melodic variations. The earlier the training begins, the greater the observed expansion. The cortex literally grows toward accumulated practice. Similarly, research conducted with London taxi drivers, whose work required memorizing hundreds of streets, routes, and landmarks before the era of GPS, revealed systematically larger hippocampi than those of the general population. The region responsible for spatial navigation and episodic memory had expanded in direct response to sustained and demanding use. What these findings reveal is that the brain is fundamentally a responsive organ. It does not wait for conscious instructions. It registers what is done repeatedly and reorganizes itself around it. There is a boundary that Doidge crossed in his work that many researchers had avoided for reasons mixing legitimate skepticism with philosophical discomfort. The question seemed almost metaphysical. A thought is immaterial. How could it alter measurable biological tissue? The answer, which emerged from decades of functional neuroimaging studies, is that thoughts activate the same neural circuits as their corresponding physical actions. When you imagine playing piano with precision and intention, the same motor regions that would be activated by actually playing are recruited by the brain. When you mentally rehearse a sequence of movements, your subsequent physical performance improves because the circuits responsible for that sequence were exercised, even without physical contact with the instrument. The brain makes no precise distinction between real experience and intensely imagined experience. This is not a poetic statement. It is the result of replicable experimental protocols. The implications of this extend far beyond athletic or musical performance. They mean that repeated patterns of thought, chronic worry, persistent rumination, habitual catastrophizing are not merely transient emotional states without structural consequence. They are practices, and like any practice, they leave verifiable biological traces. Studies with patients diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder demonstrated that cognitive behavioral therapy, conducted without any pharmacological intervention, produced measurable changes in activation patterns of the orbitofrontal cortex. Treatment based exclusively on thought processes had modified the biology of the organ. Doidge extensively documents the work of psychiatrist Jeffrey Schwartz, who developed a therapeutic protocol for OCD by teaching patients to recognize and redirect obsessions without surrendering to them, a form of deliberate attention to one's own mental functioning. With sufficient and systematic practice, the obsessive circuit gradually lost strength. It did not disappear immediately, but it weakened because it was being deprived of the repeated use that kept it robust and efficient. What emerges from this line of research is an understanding of the human being that is simultaneously more constrained and more demanding than common sense usually admits. More constrained because no one escapes the accumulated effects of their repeated patterns. More demanding because those patterns, while not permanent, do not change through isolated intention alone. Neuroplasticity is not, as certain superficial readings suggest, uniformly positive news about human potential. It is a capacity, and capacities, by definition, are neutral with respect to the direction they take. The same mechanism that enables recovery after a devastating brain injury is the mechanism by which chemical dependencies establish themselves with such depth and resistance to treatment. Substances that stimulate the massive release of dopamine do not merely produce immediate pleasure at the moment of consumption. They progressively rewrite the brain's reward circuits. The nervous system learns that that substance is the most intense source of positive signaling available in the environment, and it reorganizes its motivational hierarchies around that acquired learning. With repeated use, subjective pleasure diminishes because dopaminergic receptors become less sensitive as a regulatory mechanism. But the compulsion remains, or intensifies, because the circuit was not built to maximize pleasure. It was built to persistently seek what it has learned to recognize as salient reward. That is plasticity, pointing in the wrong direction. The same structural principle applies to other patterns of consumption and behavior, to chronic distraction induced by environments of high fragmented stimulation, to compulsive information consumption without processing, to constant exposure to social validation metrics that recalibrate the thresholds of interpersonal reward. Every pattern repeated with sufficient frequency and intensity carries a verifiable structural cost. Every structural cost produces functional consequences that become progressively harder to reverse. The central point is not moral, it is mechanical. The brain responds to what it receives repeatedly, regardless of the external observer's judgment of that content. Plasticity does not judge, it records and reorganizes.
One of the most recurrent questions in the neuroplasticity literature is direct. Is there a temporal limit? Is the adult brain as plastic as the brain of a child? The scientific answer is nuanced. Children have critical periods, developmental windows during which certain neural systems are extraordinarily receptive to organization by experience. Language acquisition, the development of binocular vision, the formation of attachment patterns, all have preferred windows of heightened sensitivity. When those windows close, plasticity does not disappear, but it requires considerably more effort to produce equivalent effects. What Doidge and other researchers have demonstrated is that the plasticity of the adult brain, while less exuberant than the infantile version, remains functional and clinically relevant throughout life. Adults learn new languages. They recover motor and cognitive functions after injuries. They develop skills they never previously possessed. What changes is not the possibility of change, it is its operational cost. Merzenich is explicit on this point. The adult brain responds to training, but it requires focused attention, deliberate repetition, and gradual progression of complexity. There are no neurological shortcuts. The process is slow, incremental, and frequently invisible in the short term. Neuroplasticity is not a promise. It is a description of how durable changes actually occur at the biological level. And that description is, by nature, demanding.
What Norman Doidge accomplished by systematizing this research was not the production of an optimization manual. It was the documentation, with clinical rigor and precise narrative, that human biology is substantially more dynamic than the previous model allowed anyone to conceive. The brain you have today is not the same brain you had 10 years ago. Not in a poetic sense, in a literal, verifiable, measurable sense. It was modified by what you did repeatedly, by what you thought persistently, by what you systematically avoided. That is not consolation. It is data. The question that neuroplasticity poses is not whether the brain can change. It changes regardless, with or without conscious intention. The relevant question is in which direction that change is occurring. The organ you use to think is being rewritten by how you think. That is everything you needed to know.